Hello everyone and welcome. It's Friday, it's 1 o'clock, so it must be Sensemaker Live from Tortoise. Our weekly lunchtime thinking when slow news collides with old-fashioned fast news. So I'm Giles, Whittell, an editor at Tortoise, and welcome to the end of a week in which great apes in San Diego Zoo were vaccinated for COVID. Great importance was attached to an email leaked from deep within Buckingham Palace in connection with alleged bullying. And more pertinent for today, a great deal of money was pledged to continue to prop up the UK economy until the end of the pandemic. How much? Well, that sort of depends on which paper you read and how you define debt and deficits, but I'd say about 600 million in all, billion, I'm sorry, 350 for last year and then another 250 added on for next. Looks like about the scale of extra borrowing for COVID. Unfortunately, we've got some experts who can put me right if I've got my numbers wrong. The question today is who will pay the bill for COVID? That divides in a sense into the debt, the extra long-term debt, which as we may have seen on Wednesday, the Chancellor emphasized will be a matter of many decades to pay off. It's convenient for him at any rate. And the deficit, which will presumably mean some pain, anxious as a politician to defer that. He found various ways of reassuring us that it won't hurt too much now, but then in a few years' time, more and more people will be dragged into higher tax brackets and corporation tax will go up to 25%. Those are the two main mechanisms that he identified to keep the public finances under control. So as far as I could work out, walking the dog just now and trying to clarify my own thoughts, which are pretty foggy on this, I should say, right from the start, that the overarching question divides into three others. Is this enough? Is it fair? And what are the alternatives? And then sort of separately, there's the long-term question of how on earth this economy, or indeed others in similar positions, deal with the enormous increase in long-term structural debt. As I say, we've got some guests who know a lot more about this than me, and I will introduce them in a second. But for those, if there are any among us who haven't been to a thinking before, I just want to remind you that this is about you. Well, it's about us. The goal is to hang up the phone, as it were, in an hour's time, or just under an hour, feeling a little more informed. And we do that by encouraging everybody to pitch in, not just our invited speakers. So you know the drill. Use the chat, please. Feel free to raise your digital hand. My colleague Ella is in the chat, and shortly we'll come back to we will come to the slides that she's prepared. But first, I want to come to Eric Lonergan, who is a hedge fund manager, an economist, a writer, and co-author of Angrynomics. Eric, thanks for joining us. Do I have it broadly right that, if we take the Chancellor and his speech on Wednesday at face value, he's trying to reassure us that no one is going to hurt short term, then the burden of stabilizing the public finances will fall on businesses and the middle class. But the whole thing is somewhat dependent on continued low rates so that money remains cheap. Is that a fair assessment?
The low rates piece is sort of fair, but it's worth just taking a step back and considering what's actually happened. So the first thing to bear in mind is that most of the government's been running a very big deficit, which is the flip side of this fact, in a sense, that the private sector has been spending has been spending less. So that's what happens in a recession, in a sense, is the private sector typically becomes very concerned, very nervous. In the case of COVID, we sort of closed the private sector down intentionally. And so the government has stepped in and supplemented all of our incomes while we're not returning to normal levels of work and activity. And as a result of that, there's been a shortfall. So the government is effectively transferring more money and spending more money than it's receiving in tax revenues. Now, the way that actual shortfall has been made up has been a relative sort of complex process, which is the government sells government bonds into the government bond market, and then the Bank of England has effectively been creating money, which is the electronic form of the notes and coins that we carry around, and it's been buying back the debt. And roughly those two considerations broadly have cancelled each other out. Now, there's a sort of philosophical question, which is, well, if we as a state, and the public, we have the central bank and the government, if one of us if we're buying back our own debt, is that really an increase in debt at all? It's slightly philosophical, really, but if you could imagine if you were buying back your own mortgage, you don't really have a mortgage. So arguably, we should subtract the debt that the Bank of England has bought when we think about the total stock of national debt, in which case there actually hasn't been much of a change. That's one consideration to make. So the first point I would say is the absolute level of debt isn't really a problem. The other point that's very important to bear in mind is, despite the fact that bond yields, which is the interest that the UK government pays on its borrowing, have risen a little bit from their lows, they're still at unprecedentedly low levels. Now, what's very important to bear in mind, because often this gets confused in the debate, is the UK government can borrow at fixed interest rates. So today, the UK government can borrow for 10 years at 0.8% fixed, 0.8 fixed for a decade. It can actually borrow up to 50 years. I'm looking at gilts on my screen here for less than 1%. So you've got, well, a 30-year, it can borrow at 1.3% fixed. Now that is actually below the underlying rate of growth of nominal GDP. So the economy grows faster than that. Those two factors combined, the fact that we've bought back most of the debt that we issue by creating our own money, and the fact that interest rates sit substantially below, or more specifically, the rate of interest at which the UK government can borrow at fixed for up to 30 years, sits substantially below the rate of growth in the economy, really means we do not have a public sector debt problem in any real sense. Now, there are some separate questions which we can come on to, but it's really important to be clear about both of these factors. First of all, the stock isn't very high, the quantity of debt isn't particularly high, and the rate of interest rate that we're paying is substantially below the rate at which our economy grows. Those are the two sort of fundamental facts that one should be aware of. There's an interesting question in a sense, which is how come if we've been able to just print money to finance our activities for the last 9 to 12 months, why don't we just always do that? And there are good reasons why we can't always do that, because we don't always put the economy on freeze for 9 months whilst we then recover. But we can talk about those issues. But in a sense, actually, nobody is really paying for this. We've just created electronic money to support us through this emergency without any evidence of any significant financial cost to the state.
Eric, thank you. Can I just pick you up on a bit of that with my bear of little brain hat on? And this is genuine. I'm not impersonating someone who doesn't know the fundamentals. I am someone who doesn't know the fundamentals. Am I right that your assertion that we do not have a public sector debt problem is it's a point of view within the economists community, but it's not the consensus? That's my first question. And the other, again, is if rates go up globally, not just within the UK, but on global markets, from first principles, it seems to me that we do suddenly have a problem tomorrow that we don't have today, in that debt servicing must take up a much larger proportion of our national income.
Okay, so let me deal with the second point, because it's very difficult to know what economists think and where the consensus is, because there are varying opinions across economists. So, which is and I'm just trying really to keep most of the observations as fact-based as possible. So in a sense, there's as little opinion involved, right? So the facts are that we can borrow at a fixed rate of interest less than half the rate of nominal GDP growth.
Okay. Yeah.
So the first important point is that that rate of interest is in fact fixed.
Yeah.
So just because the Bank of England raises interest rates, were it to raise interest rates, it doesn't immediately pass through in a mechanical fashion to the cost of your stock of debt, because the interest rate on your stock of debt is in fact fixed. However, it is the case that you're issuing new debt all of the time. So the interest on new debt, and as debt matures, you would have to refinance it at higher interest rates. That is true. Now, the key point here in terms of trying, and this is one of the difficulties to trying to ascertain, have you got a problem or how much risk is, what would really matter is the circumstances in which that occurs. So the first point to bear in mind is that there are very, very good reasons why it is highly unlikely that the Bank of England is going to be raising interest rates very significantly anytime in the near future. And the obvious reason being that there's a huge amount of spare capacity in the economy. The economy is in one of the most severe recessions it's been in. And not only that, for a very persistent period of time, I mean, for over a decade, most of the developed world central banks have been failing to meet their inflation targets. So part of the reason we have this considerable flexibility is because there has been virtually very, very low rates of measured inflation across the developed world. So to be concerned, and this is in a sense where the argument will be, you have to see a circumstance where there's going to be a sustained increase in interest rates. The most plausible scenario was outlined by the Bank of England's chief economist, and I should say, and he would be the first to admit, this is just a forecast, so take it with a pinch of salt. All economists should be aware of that. If the economy is some kind of a coiled spring and we have a huge economic boom and wages start to go up, we run out of workers in the labor market, firms start raising prices, the Bank of England, because it's got an inflation target, would then raise interest rates and the government's cost of debt would rise. But one needs to think about those circumstances. Those would in essence be fantastic circumstances in which the overwhelming majority of the population is doing far, far better because we've got wages are going up, there's lots and lots of jobs available for everybody, firms are making huge amounts of profits. And yes, the Bank of England would raise interest rates. The existing holders of government bonds would make losses, and the government would the government finances would automatically improve dramatically, right? Because in a sense, we would all of the tax take, if all of our incomes are suddenly rising and our profits are rising, automatically the fiscal position will improve very substantially. And if it were necessary, the government could raise taxes. But in a sense, the point I would make is that is something that would be great to happen because it would imply that we have a very, very strong and rapidly growing economy. So in a sense, the only thing that would genuinely be a problem would be some kind of 1970 stagflation. So the bad economic outcomes from this perspective are where somehow inflation miraculously just picks up of its own accord and starts rising. And the Bank of England has to raise interest rates, despite the fact that there are, a great number of people who are unemployed and the economy is very weak. And that I don't think anybody really has got any plausible argument as to why that should occur.
Okay. Eric, thank you very much. I apologize for the dog. If you can hear it in the background, that's just a daily thing when the postie comes.
Don't worry.
With any luck, he'll calm down. I have a son upstairs who's under orders to calm him down if he doesn't, but he is also at school. So this is just life in lockdown. In a few minutes, as promised, I want to come to Ella's slides. But first, Frances Coppola, I saw you shaking your head. Now, Frances was for many years a financial economist in the banking sector. She's a blogger. She's a singer. But she's also the author of The Case for People's QE. First of all, what were you shaking your head about?
Oh, I forget exactly. I was actually nodding along with a lot of what Eric was saying.
Okay.
Actually, it was your comment, I think, that I was kind of shaking my head about. I can't remember what it was now. One of your comments, but it was really about. I mean, the first thing that strikes me is that we're going on about this sort of horrendous level of debt. When you actually look at it in terms of our average debt level over the last 2 centuries, it's not actually that high.
In relation to GDP?
Yeah, it's not actually that high in relation to GDP. It's been much higher in the past, usually because of wars. But then in a way, coronavirus is a type of war. We're seeing the kind of disruption to people's lives, to the economy, to people's spending patterns, to everything that we see in war. And I think we should treat it like that. That, you know, we've had to put a lot of ordinary activities on hold in order to direct resources into certain sectors, so into healthcare, for example, while asking other people really to suspend what they normally do. The difference between now and wartime really is that in wartime we do tend to have full employment, whereas now we don't. And that's, I think, why the big risk from the kind of expenditures had in wartime in the past has been inflation. And I don't think that that is a serious risk now, basically because we're going to have very high unemployment. And while you have very high unemployment, your chances of having very high inflation as well are much reduced. They're not zero. Somebody pointed out 1970 style stagflation. And I agree with Eric that that's really the big risk here, is that we don't get the growth and we don't bring unemployment down, but somehow we do end up with inflation. And I think maybe a bit of understanding of what went on in the 1970s might help to clarify things there. We should bear in mind that in the 1970s, there were 2 oil price shocks. We're going to have an oil price shock because oil prices fell at the beginning of the pandemic. They crashed and they've been very low for the last year or so, and they will come back up again. So we can expect a bit of an oil price shock, but I don't think we're going to see the kind of oil price shocks that we had in the 1970s, both of which were caused by wars. And I think we should also bear in mind, and there's been some comments in the chat about devaluing the currency. I'd also want to point out that one of the reasons for the shock in the 1970s was actually coming off the fixed exchange rate system of Bretton Woods, which caused immense disruption not only to the UK, but to all of the Western economies really. And there was immense amounts of turbulence just throughout that decade generally because of it, because we were constantly trying to get back onto an exchange rate, a managed exchange rate system, and then falling out of it again and ending up with the pound on the slide. The IMF's intervention in 1976 was to stop the pound falling, really. So we have moved on from that time, and we don't tend to think of things like that again. I know there are people who, even now, who worry about the balance of payments and things like that, and it is a concern. But we haven't got the same set of circumstances that we had then. We also haven't got a huge influx of young baby boomers hitting the job market, which also happened in the 1970s. What we actually have now is, if anything, a declining working population, a growing aging population, and we had disinflationary forces pushing down on interest rates even before the pandemic. Those forces haven't gone away. So the fears about inflation, which is, I think, partly what's driving this idea that interest rates will necessarily rise and the government's borrowing costs will necessarily rise, and therefore it'll all end in tears if we don't bear down on the deficit, I think are rather, shall we say, fighting last century's war.
Okay. Francis, can I just ask you about one thing that you mentioned, namely unemployment? I don't understand about this, because for a long time, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sure I am, for a long time, 5% unemployment was regarded as full unemployment. We've been a little bit below that for the past few years. We're just passing through that now. At the end of the biggest shock to the economy since the last World War, the OBR forecasts unemployment peaking at 6.5%, down from 7.5%. That is lower, is it not, than this country has lived with for many years, and it's certainly lower than prevailing rates in much of the Eurozone.
Yes.
Why do you speak of a sort of coming unemployment? Well, you didn't use the word shock, so I won't put it into your mind, but problem.
I think the lesson of the sort of post-financial crisis years was that unemployment doesn't necessarily mean joblessness. One of the big things of the post-financial crisis years has been underemployment and flat wages. When people, so we're talking about various forms of not enough work, let's put it that way. And when people want to work more because they're not earning enough, we have underemployment, and that behaves much like unemployment on the economy, really. So I think that one of the things we potentially need to change is the way we think about what the drivers of inflation are, because in the past it's tended to be this black and white: you're either employed full-time or you are unemployed. But we have a much more fluid and dynamic labour market now, and there's all shades of grey between full sort of working for 40 hours a week in a well-paid job and being actually out of work. There's all kind of types of work and employment and bits of this and that and the other between those two, and all of those add up into a much more fluid labour dynamic, and one in which in general we have seen underemployment and low wage growth for the last decade. We aren't going to see as much actual unemployment in terms of kind of headline figures as we did in, say, the early 1980s, partly because that labour market has changed so much. But that doesn't mean we're not going to have what I guess we could call an underemployment shock.
Right. That's really interesting. And you're getting quite a lot of yes with lots of S's in the chat. Thank you very much. Francis, do not let me get to the end of the hour without coming back to you on your take on QE. You've written a whole book on it, and I'm fascinated by the phenomenon and the notion that we can just keep on doing it, which makes me distinctly uneasy. We're going to come to James Murray, the Shadow Financial Secretary of the Treasury, in a second. But can we, Ella, do we have the slides? Can we take a look at them? They were admirably clear and simple for someone like me, so I hope they help you.
Yes, I've kept it simple for my own purposes as well, I have to say. So these are just some of the headline numbers from the budget. Borrowing at 355 billion, and that's expected to fall to 234 in 21 and 2022. In terms of where that's being spent, mainly on public services, as we know, so health, test and trace vaccines, that's that 158 billion number there. 111 billion on support for households, and that's mainly taken up by the job retention scheme, so the furlough scheme. And then 75 billion is the business support schemes. So that's business rates, holidays, and things like that, and grants. One thing that will be bringing in more money over the next few years is the tax band freeze. So that will mean that as salaries rise, more people will enter into the income tax bracket and into higher rate tax bands too. And the people that will probably sort of feel this the most would be the people who are kind of on the borderline of those brackets, so lower earners and people who are just on the borderline of those higher rate tax brackets as well. And the other big change was the rise in corporate tax, which will be rising to 25% in 2023, and that's predicted to raise 17 billion by 2025. But as you can see, it's still pretty competitive in international terms, lower than the effective corporate tax rate in Germany and on par with some of the other wealthier European countries, but it is higher than the EU average, which is low because of some super low corporate tax rates in Eastern Europe. So some things are staying the same. Sunak said that, you know, this will be the work of many decades and many governments to pay back this COVID bill. And so some things aren't going up. One of the things that's been a bit controversial is that fuel tax hasn't been increased, and that's people have said it's a shame given that we've got COP26 this year. Some of those other things will be maintained until 2026, so the pension lifetime allowance and inheritance tax thresholds, and that's after the next general election. In terms of what people thought, generally it's been positive. People think that it's good and fair. People are worried about the state of the economy, generally speaking. They don't think it's in good shape. 63% of people think that it's in a bad way. And they were generally supportive of those two major changes that we mentioned earlier in the slides, the increase on the corporation tax rate and the freezing of the income tax threshold.
Thanks very much, Ella. I've been noting in the chat while you were talking a question from Bruce Davis, or a suggestion about what the big question is, and let's make sure we come to that, Bruce. Lillian asks, how does this government borrow compare with the last couple of years? Well, from memory, it rose by a factor of about 8. As I recall, the projected borrowing in the March 2020 budget was around 41 billion. Multiply that by 8 for COVID, and more over the next year. So it's a very, very substantial uptick, which is why I'm kind of surprised that people aren't more bothered about it. But we're very lucky to have with us James Murray, as I say, Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Thanks for joining us. You may have missed right at the top, I was trying to break down our headline question, who will pay the bill for COVID, into 3 subsidiary ones, which are perhaps more directly related to the budget. Has enough money been earmarked? Is it fair? And what are the alternatives? And I suppose, given your front bench position, I should focus on the middle of those. Is it fair? Do you think the burden, such as there is one, is going to fall on the right people, the right sectors of the economy?
No, thanks for that, Giles. And actually, I think that question relates to a point that you said, I think, in your introduction early on, which I wanted actually to pick up on, because I'm not sure I agree with the assumption, which is that you said words to the effect of no one is hurting in the short term as a result of the budget that we had this week. And you know, if you look at actually what wasn't said in the budget, what wasn't talked about is the council tax increase in April. So 5% council tax increase. We know that council tax is not a progressive tax. You know, that's going to hit families across the board. So let's not ignore that just because the Chancellor chose to ignore it. If you look at some of the timing of the withdrawal of some of the other help, so the uplift to universal credit going to be taken out sharply in 6 months' time, whereas other changes like corporation tax, you know, deferred by a couple of years. So actually the pain is coming very quickly for people on some of the lowest incomes and who are struggling to get by, whereas being deferred for businesses. So, you know, I think if you add that together, plus what's come out today around this 1% increase, this kind of, you know, I don't think it's melodramatic to call it a slap in the face, really, for NHS staff, that 1%. You know, all of that sort of adds up to me that actually people are hurting in the short term. There have been decisions taken by the government. It obviously wasn't what they wanted to focus on in the headlines Wednesday, but it's there.
Yes, point taken. I was trying to sort of summarize what the message that the Chancellor was trying to put over. You know, I mean, the spin on the day, but clearly, I take your point. is it notable that there was nothing remotely like a wealth tax in the budget? You might not have expected anything like that, given that the Conservatives have shown themselves to be allergic to it, but in the past. But these are historic circumstances, and my colleague Kim Darrow recently did a really interesting piece of research based on models offered by the Wealth Tax Commission and based on polling showing that of all the options available to British voters, a wealth tax was the least unpopular to pay for this singular cost, the cost attached to the pandemic. Do you think it's at all surprising there's not even a nod in that direction in budget?
Well, I think actually what I'd like to pick up is actually an assumption in your question. Sorry to keep questioning.
No, that's fine.
Questions, but I think it's important because you said, was I surprised there weren't certain taxes there in order to pay off this COVID debt? And actually, I sort of think that is the wrong way to talk about it and to think about what's happening now, because this is not a debt that we have to pay off urgently through cuts. That would be entirely the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to invest in growth, to invest in jobs, to make sure the economy grows, and that's the way to make the situation sustainable in the long run. And although there are slightly different formulations that come forward from different politicians, one of the central debates that I can see, and this is me, having been in national politics for a year, obviously in local politics for a decade before that, but one of the debates I can see in national politics is people's instincts around, if you're confronted with a debt, do you go for cuts to try and support this notion in your head of sort of paying it back, paying it down as quickly as you can? Or do you say we invest and we need to invest in growth and we need to invest in jobs and make sure we've got a healthy population and so on going forward? And although it's not totally straightforward about where everyone lands on that spectrum, for me and from where we're coming from, it has to be through investment that we tackle the public finances in the long run. It has to be through investing in growth, investing in jobs, and making sure we get on top of things that way. So if we're talking about raising money through taxation, the part of the debate that actually hasn't been focused on as much this week, I mean, it's been there, but it hasn't been sort of drawn out to the surface, is what are you raising taxes to spend them on, right? And for me, if you're raising taxes, and it should be always done in a progressive way, I mean, progressive taxation is in my DNA, that's how you should raise taxes. But if you are going to raise tax, if you're going to raise tax income, what do you spend it on? And our argument is that you spend it on investment in growth, and investment in infrastructure, investment in public services, supporting businesses, creating jobs, and so on, because it's through that growth that you build a sustainable economy, society, and so on, not through this kind of a very, I think it's fair to say, totally discredited view that you somehow have to raise taxes and cut services to pay back debt as quickly as you can. The kind of austerity we've seen over the last 10 years, which has been so destructive. And actually, this is not just me saying it as a Labour politician. There's IMF, OECD, and so on are saying you shouldn't cut back now. You shouldn't, you shouldn't go through austerity. You need to invest in growth and tackling unemployment and so on. So I think in a way the debate has moved certainly in a direction which I feel is closer to where I think we should be. I think we should be talking about investment in growth and so on. I think what was a real letdown about the response to the situation, a letdown in terms of what the Chancellor was saying, is that it seemed to me that the tax rises he was talking about were still in that old-fashioned idea of paying down the debt rather than growing our way through it. And the level of investment was just nowhere near the scale that we're talking about. I mean, there was no kind of big investment plan there to create jobs through tackling climate change. There was obviously nothing about social care or home building, but it just felt like it didn't really rise to the challenge of the times ahead.
Okay, social care, home building, new green infrastructure. Where else would Labour invest for growth? I mean, we know that the context is a prime minister who's actually much more of a spender than a scrimper, and intended before the pandemic came along to do a lot of old-fashioned sort of concrete and reinforced concrete infrastructure development. This has been somewhat derailed by the pandemic, but there were one or two initiatives mentioned in the budget, including an infrastructure bank with a rather small capitalization and some free ports. What would Labour do nationally that's on a different scale from that?
Yeah, so I think two things in response to that. Firstly, just a side point, but I think, you know, this characterization of Boris Johnson as somehow in favour of investment versus Rishi Sunak, I don't really know how true that is, to be honest. I mean, Boris Johnson sort of goes with the wind a bit on this. You know, he's a populist, and I mean, my job before being an MP, I was at City Hall. So we had to pick up the kind of the inheritance, shall I say, that we got when we got in there in 2016. You know, all that money spent on the Garden Bridge that never got built, and money just spent on projects which were kind of vanity projects. So there is a sort of, I'm not sure quite how coherent an ideology it is from Boris Johnson. You know, it's a little more opportunistic, I think, than can be made out. I think the crucial point for us in terms of the future economy of the country would be about jobs across the country, you know, and that is such a crucial point in that, you know, I think you could see that the government felt a bit weak on that, or felt it was an issue they needed to address a bit, and so they, you know, made comments around, you know, obviously relocating some Treasury civil servants and so on. So there's a few bits here and there which they talked about. It just, again, didn't feel anywhere near on the scale you need to really drive job creation in every part of the country. And you know, if we are going to make this a country where the economy is more balanced and fairer, and where people don't have to leave town to move to a city somewhere else to get a job, where they can actually get one locally, you know, that requires jobs to be created, investment in businesses, in places right across the country. And that kind of plan, I think, as well as the other points you mentioned, social care, housing, green, tackling climate change and so on, that was kind of missing from the plan on anywhere near the scale that's necessary.
But just to be clear, let's fantasize about a Labour government being in power. What's the mechanism? You say invest in jobs and businesses across the country. Do you see a role for government in choosing the sector, or is it much more a case of making funds available for anybody who wants to come and apply?
Yeah, well, there'll be a range of ways in which you support job creation. There isn't a single way that you do it, but the focus of the investment has to be in different regions. You know, it has to be something where you prioritize it to invest in different parts of the country, and whether that's supporting particular industries who need support to get off the ground, you know, whether that's making sure that businesses can access money for investment themselves. You know, there's a whole range of different ways you can do it, but the crucial point is to make sure it happens right across the country. Right.
We're still at, I'm really interested in the specifics, because I get the general point, but I wonder how does that change communities in practice? I mean, are we talking about, for example, the Teesside scheme, which involves the local mayor championing, among other things, a CCS project bigger than any envisaged, that if it happens, would tick the box of local investment, local job creation, and there'd be green jobs. Are we talking about schemes like that, not necessarily as green, not necessarily on brownfield sites, but just a big basket of different types of projects, but of that scale all over the country, or what?
Yeah, well, as I say, I'm not being evasive. I'm just saying that there are different ways you can intervene to support job creation. You know, there isn't a single project which you press go and it happens everywhere across the country. And there's different projects and there's different ways in which you can intervene. You know, do you support particular industries? Do you make sure that businesses can access capital to fund investment? and so on. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways you can intervene. But, you know, if you're looking at things which really can benefit the whole country, you know, what about, just think of an example top of my head, which fits with the discussion we've been having, but, you know, electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. If that's really going to work, you need a lot of cables. You need a lot of power points. You need a lot of infrastructure to go in there. That is jobs for people right across the country, because you can't put in a cable in Newcastle if you live in London. You know, it's one where you really do have people across the country working on it. And I think that's just one example. You know, I don't want the whole discussion to be about that. I was just giving you just an example of what you'd want to support. So you want to make sure that you have the overall environment which supports the installation of the infrastructure, that individual local businesses can set up and get going and get people trained up, that they have access to a local workforce who has the skills necessary to implement, and so on. So it's part of the whole, you know, the whole ecosystem, I guess, of job creation. But the focus has to be on making sure jobs are there across the country, because it shouldn't be a kind of either or thing. You know, there's you have to have cities and towns and regions across the country all playing their part if we're going to succeed as a country.
Okay, thanks very much, James. I do want to come back to the sort of glaring absence of specifically green building back better in the budget, given that so many promises had been made in that regard. And I might come to Bruce about that. But first, Jelena, you've put in the chat that women have been systematically discriminated against in the government's economic policies. Can you say what you mean? I mean, it's clear what you mean, but I'm just, if you can drill down a bit.
I'm referring to the report that was published not so long ago by the Women and Equalities Committee that basically said that government policies have been repeatedly, if not skewed towards men, then systematically disenfranchising women. So, for instance, you know, there are the obvious statistics that women are more likely to be doing care in the home. I think that, and I don't want to be misquoted here, but I think that it's something like 2 times more likely to take unpaid leave than men. They work something like 1 hour for every 3 hours that men have been working during the pandemic, and yet at the same time, more likely to take on all this unpaid work and less likely to qualify for furlough and sick pay as a result of that. And I was just interested in talking to Phoebe in the chat really about the need to, as we're talking about build back better with respect to green policies and things like that, it's also important to recognise that feeds into gender rights too. And I think it was the EHRC and the British Chamber of Commerce that recognised how important flexible working and access to affordable childcare, things like that, will be when it comes to ensuring that we are growing the economy after the pandemic.
Now, I should know the answer to this question, but did you see anything in the budget that addressed that imbalance that you mentioned, that women being much less likely on average to be eligible for furlough support?
I didn't see anything specific in the budget to that. And I'm not really surprised about that, to be honest, because there seems to have been very little political recognition of, you know, the way that women are systematically disenfranchised, because it's not taken on an intersectional approach.
By the way, while we're on this, does it come down to a lack of representation at cabinet level, or is it?
Partly, and I think that was what was interesting, what came up in the report by the Women and Equalities Committee. I think something like 6 of Johnson's 26-person cabinet are women. And, you know, the committee chair, Caroline Noakes, really criticised those women who are involved in cabinet for their limited involvement and their calibre. I wonder just how visible and effective they have been as leaders during the pandemic. But I think more than anything, I agree with Noakes on the notion of there being a sort of institutional thoughtlessness when it comes to policy making. It's not necessarily that you know, these policies are intended to disenfranchise women or to exclude them from support. It's just that because there aren't enough heads at the table, perhaps, and the cabinet is very much permeated with the blokey mentality that comes with, I'm sure, an Eton education, you know, those those kind of things, talking about working from home or childcare, they're not included in the discussion when it comes to these policies and what is necessary in order to ensure that support is evenly distributed.
It's really interesting. Here was I thinking, this is really interesting, but we're veering away from the topic. And of course, we're not veering away from the topic at all. The question is, who will pay the bill for COVID? And the more it is true that women are taking on unpaid work as a result of it, the more it is true that women are paying the bill for COVID.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
This may involve a handbrake turn, but let's go to Bruce anyway, who's got his hand up. You always get points for that, Bruce. Tell us what is worrying you about what's missing from the budget. I suspect that's what you're...
Well, it wasn't so much missing, it wasn't a very headline feature, I guess. So probably the most important thing for me was not in the budget, but the letter that we sent to the Bank of England to say, you need to think about green investing as part of your mandate. I think that's pretty epochal change for the Bank of England, as big as being independent.
Sorry, we being who?
Democracy.
No, sorry, you said the letter that we sent to the Bank of England.
So the Treasury writes to the Bank of England every year and reminds it that it has a 2% target for inflation. And on top of that, they've said you need to think about net zero, which previously they were assiduously neutral on. Now they're not. That's great. That will change things. That's a separate sort of change, structural shift. I think in terms of the budget and what, talking about spending, I think that's part of the problem. We only really think of the budget in terms of spending. And yes, I think specific investments were a bit thin on the ground, but I think the promise of the green gilt is a big win and a big shift. So 15 billion green gilt potentially coming out this year. So that's money that is earmarked for green investment. So that's positive.
Where specifically do you expect that money to end up?
Well, that will be according to the green finance principles that they're saying they're signing up to. So that will go into, I think, different sorts of projects, green infrastructure, as was mentioned, things like EV charging and so on. Hopefully it will be used, and hopefully the National Infrastructure Bank will take on some of that, because a lot of that money is designed to bring in other forms of capital, both private and public. So picking up on the local agenda, working with municipal authorities and helping them to fund that local infrastructure. I think that could be a real boost. And then you're getting down to the brass tacks, which I think has been discussed. They're to specific regions and communities, because I think the other thing that was in that letter was also about this idea of just transition. So that the shift to green should not just be a case of a sort of technological revolution that leaves people behind, but actually something that enables communities to be more resilient. We are going to see changes from climate, it will affect us, but then also better able to cope collectively. So we're now saying that green infrastructure is a public good, and we should create that and build it. And that's going to need both private and public money. So I think hopefully the national savings bond, that's a green bond, which will back some of that money, will take some of the excess saving we've got in the economy. And I think that's one thing we've not talked about. There is an excess of perhaps 150, 200 billion in the economy at the moment from people not spending. That money doesn't just go into shops, although some demand would be good. It gets channeled into investment. So,
okay, sorry to interrupt. Briefly, Bruce, while we have you, you mentioned the National Infrastructure Bank. Its sort of starting budget is small compared with European equivalents. As someone who's in that space, and for newcomers to the thinking, Bruce is in that space, do you take it seriously?
Well, 12 billion is a reasonable number, but I think it's the 40 billion it needs to leverage. How that will work is important. So I think, no, it's not on the scale that the EIB was at full flow, but I don't think you get from a standing start to that. So I think it's a step in the right direction to have a funder that replaces that European Development Bank. We desperately needed that.
Yeah.
And I think the key thing here is that you're you're building the foundations for this infrastructure. Take EV charging, for example. At the moment, that's quite expensive and difficult to put in. We're looking at a project in the next few months in Manchester where we're really trying to prove the model. Once you've proven the model, as we found with offshore wind, you make it cheaper and easier to roll out. And that's what we need to do. So we need a development bank. We need someone to prove the models and get this moving. So if anything, it's not about scale, it's about targeting. It's about making sure this goes in the right places and targets the right things. We've got a lot of things to do, but the debates are still to be had on things like heat and transport as to the best way of achieving it. And I think the NIB has a role to play there in terms of giving some help and direction on how we're going to achieve that.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. I said I wanted to come back to Francis on QE while we have the chance. Right at the beginning, Francis, Eric gave a sort of high-level 2-sentence explanation of how it works. I'm fascinated that we can do this. I'm fascinated that it doesn't seem to cause inflation. What is the actual process? Who does what with what keystrokes in what rooms in the Treasury and the Bank of England? And is QE the answer to debt as well as deficits?
Well, I mean, I can talk you through exactly what happens, but basically the Bank of England buys mostly government bonds, but it has also bought corporate bonds from private sector actors, mostly non-banks. There's a widespread belief that the Bank of England buys bonds from banks, but actually it doesn't. It actually buys them from non-banks. But because the purchases are intermediated by banks, because all money, everything goes through banks, banks are involved. And so the end result of this is that the bonds end up on the Bank of England's balance sheet, and the money ends up in 2 forms in the private sector. Firstly, in the form of actual deposits in the bank accounts of the non-banks that the gilts have been bought from. And secondly, also in the form of increased bank reserves. Reserves are a particular kind of money that banks use to settle payments between themselves, but they don't circulate in the wider economy. They only go between banks, and they are pounds. They are exchangeable one for one with pounds. They are pounds to all intents and purposes, but it's just that only banks hold them. So the Treasury's involvement is that the Treasury, in effect, indemnifies the Bank of England for any losses. That the whole way we do QE in this country essentially takes it off the Bank of England's balance sheet and backstops it with a Treasury facility, so that if there are any losses to the Bank of England arising from QE, for example, if they buy some gilts and the price falls and they then have to sell them and they make a loss, no, not that they've done that, then the Treasury would indemnify them for that loss. And that's how we do it. So the taxpayers would end up paying. So that's roughly how it works. QE is a macroeconomic tool. It's not about financing government. And I think it's really important to understand this. The Bank of England doesn't buy bonds that the government's only just issues. It buys them in the open market. And it does so when interest rates are on the floor, and it thinks it can't really cut them any further because negative interest rates have all kinds of perverse effects on the economy which aren't fully understood, because lots of us could just switch to physical cash instead, and banks could start stuffing their vaults with banknotes and things like that. So what they do is they buy gilts, which has the effect of depressing the yields on those bonds, and not just on the bonds that they're buying, but on other bonds as well, because these non-banks that they're buying from are mostly things like pension funds. And instead of spending that money into the economy, sort of buying things, they're going to buy other assets. And so they buy other assets, they buy other bonds, they might buy stocks, they might buy commodities. So we have seen QE money going into all sorts of things. And that has the effect of raising asset prices across the board. The other side of that being, of course, that people realize that price is the inverse of yield. So when you raise the price of an asset, of a bond, its yield falls, and the effect of that is to depress market interest rates. The idea being to encourage a bit more activity on the part of corporations, get them borrowing, get them investing, get them hiring people. And the jury's out on how effective QE was at doing that after the financial crisis. My view is that it did ward off the kind of 1930s deflationary asset price collapse. And it did, to some extent, which unclear exactly how much, over time, reduce unemployment. But the downside of that was that it increased wealth inequality and has been much criticised for that. Is that a sufficient explanation, Giles?
Yes, my sense is that I've dipped my toe. Mehdi, I'm really sorry. Let's come very quickly to you, Mehdi, and then we've got about 1 minute for each of our main speakers to have a final word. I'm so sorry to be brief, Mehdi.
No problem, Giles. Thank you. I just wanted to raise a point with regard to the allocation of the grants funds for the regions. It appears that of the 74 different allocations, 54 or thereabout are Tory held constituencies, in the way they've got Tory MPs, or they've got the local authorities there. And I think there were 20 Labour, etc. Not quite sure exactly about the numbers. But the point I wanted to raise is there do not appear to be any transparencies how these allocations have actually taken place. A constituency like Richmond in Yorkshire actually been allocated the money. Good luck to them. But next door, Barnsley has been neglected, apparently.
Right.
Therefore, I think just wanted to raise that. And very quickly, if I may, there was a lack of or absence of any windfall tax that, some enterprises who fared well during the pandemic, like Amazon, they did not seem to have actually figured in Mr. Sunak's consideration. Very quickly.
Okay, good point. Thank you. Even though Biden is considering it. Let me come back to James then for your final word. And if you want to pick up on what Mehdi was saying about the 54 out of 74 regional uplifts going to Tories, but also if you could kind of as concisely as possible address the overarching question: who's going to pay this bill in the end? You made the point earlier that cutting language is inappropriate, growth language is more appropriate, but we're still I'm still not quite sure if that squares the circle for paying the bill in the end.
Yeah, so I think the way you ask the question is important in this, because we've got used to talking about things in a way which I think is really unhelpful. Around household budgets and maxing out credit cards and all those awful analogies which are destructive for really thinking about how the economy works. So it's really important that when we talk about who we should tax and what we should use it for, two principles are crucial for me. Firstly, the taxation system must be progressive and it should be fairer than it is now. Now, you might expect me to say that, from my politics, but it's something worth saying, and it's something where I think the British public agree with us on, that taxation should be fairer. The second point is then when you raise that money, what should you do with it? And my argument is that you should invest it in growth. You should invest it in bringing down unemployment. And if you invest it in the economy, you make a fairer society, you make things more sustainable, more secure in the long run. And that is the way to get through the years ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Clear enough. Eric, I'm really sorry to have left it so long, but let me come back to you. You said at the top that, well, basically all my premises were wrong, and that a key point was that the government could borrow for up to 50 years at very, very low fixed rates, so we don't have the debt problem that was the premise for this whole debate. Am I now veering too far over to the sanguine side?
Yes and no. So effectively, as Francis kind of made clear, this is a huge distraction, the issue of changes in tax rates and the national debt. All we're actually doing is effectively shifting numbers between ourselves in the future and different parts of our population currently. The net effect of all of this has actually been zero. And what really matters is people's health and people's economic activity. Now that we, broadly speaking, those issues are being tackled, we have to confront the two other major crises that we have. One is the sustainability of the planet, and the other one is astonishingly extreme wealth and income inequality, which has been persisting for the best part of 20 to 30 years. The frank reality is nowhere on the political spectrum are there any serious ideas to deal with both of those challenges. And all of this stuff about making setting up a few little investment banks here or there, issuing a green bond, which has about 10 to 20 basis points of a fraction of a percent difference on the cost of finance, frankly, in economic terms, is noise. We actually need new institutions in the United Kingdom. We need to overhaul monetary policy so that if we need further monetary stimulus, we have a big reduction in interest rates on targeted lending towards sustainable green energy investment, right? And by which I mean -4% interest rates for 5 years for green energy investments. We need to set up a sovereign wealth fund immediately, and I'm talking about 30% of GDP, to provide assets for people in the UK who don't have assets. I mean, the reality is 60 to 70% of the UK population has virtually no assets. That's entirely unacceptable given the amount of economic growth we've had over the last 50 years. If I'm brutally honest about it, most of this is a complete distraction and complete noise. There are genuine crises facing societies. The political reaction to those crises to date has been nationalism. And if we really want to tackle it, we need new institutions. We need to be thinking about how do we set up the equivalent of a national health service, but one that tackles wealth inequality. And we need an equivalent that's going to set up the institutions actually to deal with climate in a serious way. And frankly, all of the stuff about national debt is a complete distraction. There's no inflation. These are just numbers on spreadsheets that we've shifted around. They're liabilities and assets, all with the same population. It just depends who you are. And we're borrowing against ourselves in the future. The net effect of it is not significant.
Eric, James, Francis, thank you all for your input. We could have gone on all afternoon. It's a massive subject. I've learned a huge amount. Certainly in terms of points of view, and I really like the sound of -4% interest rates for 5 years for green energy investment. Thank you, Jelena, for pitching in and making me realize that the people who pay for COVID are not necessarily those who write checks. They are also those who forego jobs and opportunity as a result of it. I think insofar as there's a consensus from the past hour, it is, as Eric was just saying, that old-fashioned debate about debts and deficits may be a massive distraction, given especially the climate emergency, which was briefly obscured as if by a passing storm cloud by COVID, but is very, very much with us. I feel bags of pages of notes. Thank you so much. We're a little over time already. So thank you to our speakers once again, to everyone else for coming. Have a great weekend. And I hope the sun stays out for some of us. Bye-bye.